don't think there are very many murder cases like this one. The horror of what happened is something that nobody ever expects.
Officer down. 25 call for EMS. Justin, breathe! Breathe, Justin, breathe!
And everything about it, the way the night started from the defendant's point of view, that he was just out shooting at animals and shooting at stop signs. I grew up doing that. But the way it evolved from that to end up shooting and murdering a game warden is crazy. I got involved in this case because the elected DA of Wharton County, which is close to home where I'm from, Matagorda County, had never tried a death penalty case before. So these are the people I grew up with. This is my world. When I met Justin's family, I'm pretty sure I cried a lot because they're wonderful people, and anyone who met Justin's family would want to get justice for them.
I'm a Texas game warden. We work where people hunt, where people fish. Our biggest focus is going to be making sure everybody's got their license and their permits and everything that they're supposed to have in order to do that legally. Our job's a little bit different than most law enforcement. Most of the people we deal with don't break the law. The flip side of that, though, is during hunting season, everybody we check has a gun. In Wharton County, there are 2 game wardens. And as game wardens, we work predominantly alone. That night, I called my partner, Justin. We were close. We got along really good at the academy. And I said, okay, so where are you going? He said, I'm going to go up to Garwood area. And I said, okay. I said, where do you think I should go? He said, I'd go up there to the Bernard Prairie where we noticed that a lot of the street signs had been shot, significantly shot. You could tell it was pretty current, recent activity. That's one of those things that we kind of look for in the off season because there's not a whole lot going on. And the shooting from a public roadway in Texas is illegal. He said, maybe sit up there somewhere, maybe you'll catch somebody. And so that's where I headed. I got up on County Road 279 and I parked my truck, turned all my lights off. Normally, I would sit on that road for 2 hours and not see a car. But I saw a truck turn off Highway 90 coming towards me, driving extremely slow. That's kind of a clue for us that there might be up to no good. So I'm sitting in the truck and I'm watching him through binoculars. And he shoots. My immediate thought was, this is the guy I'm looking for. As I was approaching him, we were face to face, which is not ideal for a police stop. Ideally, I'd be behind him so I could see everything in front of me. And when he's slowly rolling towards me, initially I thought maybe he was just getting closer so we could talk. Instead, he just slowly drove past my truck. I was just going to write him a ticket and send him home. Class C misdemeanor, just like getting a traffic ticket or running a stop sign. And he takes off. I was kind of shocked. This isn't normal. Now I got a guy that's not stopping, failure to yield. So that's serious. So we just upped a charge.
When the suspect takes off the way he did, you have to chase him. What are you going to do? Let people just get away with it when they take off from you? And what kind of precedent does that set? That's how you handle it.
Game warden pursuing a vehicle in the area of Eagle Lake, Colorado County, Wharton County, Lissy.
We jump on Highway 90. He was driving really fast, over 100. And my truck can't keep up. County deputies and the state troopers also joined in. Luckily, a constable was able to catch up to him. The constable was able to get behind him and call on the license plate. And it comes back to a James Garrett Freeman.
You really had to watch your speed so you didn't lose control of your vehicle.
Sounded like a 22, what I could hear.
We need to try to get him stopped somehow. And really the only way that we can see so far to do that is to get stop sticks.
All units, we have spikes deployed at County Road 260. Spikes deployed right in front of y'all.
We tried to spike the vehicle several times, and it's almost like he knew where we were at because he would go the other way.
4113 unit. What's the speed at this time?
50 miles an hour.
4113. That's good. You want me to try to block him off here or try to let him pass?
Justin asked, hey, do you want me to block his vehicle? And I don't know what officer came over the radio and said it, but he's like, hey, it's your truck. And Justin did use his vehicle to block the road.
We're north on 279. I'm not sure. He may have struck 4111's vehicle.
When he hits Justin's truck, now we have assault on the police officer. We've just upped the charge to a felony.
North on County Road 279.
Once he struck the truck and kept going, I knew that, this was very serious because he was not giving up easy.
3132, we're headed east on 264.
We drove around the same area for almost an hour.
What was going through my head was this guy is from the area because he's staying close and doing circles and taking the same roads.
We're setting up at 279. If he comes back this way, we'll be set up.
I could see the troopers set up, and there was really nowhere for him to go around. And he ended up hitting the spikes. There was a little relief because now I'm like, okay, this is going to end. Let's get this guy in custody and get him in jail.
3132 vehicle stop.
You don't know what's going to happen, but it's pretty repetitive. They either stop and give up or they get out and run. And this night was different.
I drew my pistol and tried to put rounds somewhere that direction.
There was a point where he disappeared behind his truck into the cab. And at that time, I'm like, I just got to try to hit this guy. And I start firing through his back window. He reemerges from the truck, and this time he starts shooting with a rifle. You could tell it was an AK-47 or an AR, just the way it sounded.
I didn't want to get caught behind my door. Doors don't stop bullets. And so I wanted to have something solid between me and him. And so I retreated back to get behind Justin's truck. Justin flanks me. He's trying to get a clear shot. I can see him down in the ditch. And so as Justin and Freeman exchange gunfire, I look over and I see Justin's laying on the ground.
All right.
So I ran out to him and
Justin, breathe! Breathe, Justin! Breathe! Hey, Justin! Breathe! 2555 Pierce. Officer down. Just off US 90.
I wanted to make sure he's okay. And when I got to him, I knew he would.
Bitch.
Come on, 5-7, call for EMS.
5-7 code. Starting CPR.
And the shooting stopped.
Where's he at? I don't know.
I saw the suspect running away from us, and first thing I thought was there's a tree line that I knew was there. And at that point, I'm thinking, if he gets in that tree line with that rifle, we're in trouble. And I just had to take a deep breath, and I shot 2 more times. And that's when I saw him drop.
Where's he at? He's laying on the ground. Anybody else in the car?
Once he's down, me and my sergeant were able to clear the vehicle and secure the suspect together. Once we get him secured, I could hear, which I think was Blackburn, saying, hey guys, Justin's been hit and he's hurt really bad.
3, 4, 5, break.
Somebody finally took over for me doing CPR. And I knew Justin wasn't in a good spot. I think I asked somebody if the gunman was down and out.
Did y'all kill him?
I don't think so.
Did y'all shoot him?
Yes.
I said, you just shot one of my brothers. And he had no expression, nothing to say to us. And he had that blank stare on his face. Like he didn't care. Like he was so angry that we caught him.
I'm starting CPR now.
I wanted to make sure that Justin got justice.
Come on, Justin. Come on. Come on, Justin, son. Here's my brother.
He didn't have a violent past.
He had some sort of fantasy, being the aggressor in a shootout with the police.
I shoot a lot of down. One of my favorite things to do.
After a wild shootout, the first responders were desperately trying to save Game Warden Justin Hurst's life. While the shooter, James Garrett Freeman, is arrested and transported for his injuries to a nearby hospital, Game Warden Justin Hurst is life-flighted via helicopter to the best trauma center around in Houston, and the Hurst family is notified of the shooting.
We were staying with Justin and his
He
wife
and Amanda.
and Kyle, who was 4 months old at the time. Amanda went into Houston, so her and I were going to get the babysit.
I really thought Justin was going to beat me home, but he wasn't there when I got home. And so I thought, well, he probably saw someone with a spotlight or someone called for backup on something. So I went ahead and went to bed, and sometime in the night, maybe 2 o'clock or so, there was a knock at the door. And when I opened the door and I saw Justin's captain there, I pushed him and just pushed him and pushed him. And I was like, nope, go away from my door. I don't want to talk to you. I tried to shut the door on him. I knew whatever he had to say, it wasn't going to be good.
The captain said, Amanda, he said, Justin's been shot. We need to get dressed and go to the hospital as fast as we can.
All I could think was, we're brand new parents. You know, this can't be the end. We got to the hospital. And the doctors said, you know, we did everything we could, but he was gone.
When he was a young kid, Justin was interested in the outdoors. Later on, he graduated from A&M and went to work for Texas Parks and Wildlife.
Justin and I met. I was in college still, and he was already working for TPWD. I spent my first summer as his intern. We worked together banding model ducks, tagging alligators. Justin wasn't an attention seeker. He didn't like the focus to be on him. Very easygoing, very lighthearted. We dated for 3 years and spent a lot of time just doing outdoor activities. The first time he made me a homemade chicken fried steak with homemade biscuits, I knew I'd hit the jackpot. Justin and I were married in April of 2001. It was perfect.
And then he was accepted into the Game Warden Academy.
It's an honor, really, to become a game warden in Texas.
Justin was kind of our top cadet. He taught us waterfowl identification as a cadet. He had a passion for ducks and geese and waterfowl.
Kyle was born in November of 2006.
He was so excited about being a dad. And he never got the chance.
Justin's birthday was March 17th, and when he was killed, he made it 20 minutes into his 34th birthday.
I kept asking God, why did you take my son? He had so much to offer. Why?
Game wardens have a very dangerous job. What I used to know about game wardens from sitting out at the deer lease opening night of deer season, knowing that they sneak up on you to check on you, catching you at night if you're out spotlighting, looking for coons to shoot, which is what we did growing up. You're on the lookout for game wardens, but I would feel like the main thing you think when you see one is you just want to flee or run away. You sure never think a shootout's going to happen. The night this shootout happened, it was involving a couple of different law enforcement agencies. There are 254 counties in Texas. Except for the 5 largest, all the other counties typically call in the Texas Rangers for their expertise and their assistance. So the Texas Rangers take the lead in this investigation too.
I got to the crime scene before daylight, and once the sun comes up, we start putting markers at every piece of evidence. Freeman, he used 2 weapons, a Glock 357 SIG, and he had an AK-47. We also have the defendant's truck. We find out that he has multiple weapons in his truck in addition to the weapons he used. We also have all the vehicles there, which are evidence.
Over a dozen bullet holes in my truck. I had one go through the windshield and exit behind my headrest, the back window. He was shooting where I should have been, or where he thought I was.
After the crime scene, I go to the hospital where Freeman is being treated and talk to him about why he did it. Well, Freeman was shot 4 times in the extremity, but his condition at the hospital was surprisingly good. He had some through and through wounds, but those were doing fine. He had to have surgery on his ankle, but he was doing well. And he was very coherent. I read him his rights, and he talked to me without really any hesitation. And I asked him what was going on that night. He said, I decided I was going to go out and do a little night hunting with my .22 and shoot a possum or something like that. After he shot one, the next thing he knew, he had lights on him and a game warden was there, and then he ran.
What made you think I'm not going to stop? Can you tell me what was going through your mind at that time?
I don't know. I don't even have the answer to that. It's costing me more money, I guess.
So you thought maybe you could get away?
Well, I don't think I was thinking that, because I know you can't get away. I mean, even if you do outrun him, you're not going to outrun the radios.
He had no outstanding warrant, or he didn't have a lot of violations of the law on his record. He just decided that he was going to try and run. And then at the point in time where he couldn't run anymore, he decided that he was going to have a shootout.
This is kind of your opportunity to tell your side of the story and what was going on with you that, caused you to do this. Because from what I understand, this is not your nature.
I don't know why that was. I can kind of remember what my thought was. What the hell are you doing? You're going to get killed. Shot. You're not going to, just run away from it.
We were watching the video. When you jumped out, you looked like you knew what you were doing with that pistol.
I shoot a lot of cows.
Do you?
One of my favorite things to do.
He told me he didn't really understand why he did what he did, but accepted that responsibility for what he did.
It was a very tragic thing. An officer was killed.
The officer died over his name.
His name is Justin Hurst. Nice young man. His wife just had a baby. How do you feel about that?
Terrible. Wasn't no reason for it, honestly.
After Texas Ranger David Maxwell interviewed James Garrett Freeman at the hospital, he was officially charged with capital murder. Under Texas law, he's facing the death sentence. This case is different because you have a defendant who, I found out later, he didn't live a life of crime, but one night in his life, one night of God knows what was going on in his head, and a whole world was changed just by stupid decisions. And there are consequences for every one of those decisions. I'm Kelly Siegler, and I make this promise, the same promise I make to all victims. I won't quit, and I will not give up. I will do what needs to be done. I always have. In 2007, the man in charge of our office, the DA's office in Harris County, basically imploded for lots of reasons. The office was in chaos, and no one knew what was going to happen next. Some friends encouraged me to run, so I ran, I campaigned, I got into a runoff, and then I lost the race for DA. I really felt defeated. I felt like a loser. I found myself thinking, what am I going to do? Because the lady who beat me was never going to keep me, and I was never going to work for her. And then a friend of mine named Ted Wilson was friends with Josh McCown, the elected DA of Wharton County, which is close to home where I'm from, Matagorda County. And Josh called Ted to say, I need some help on this death penalty case. I don't have the experience. I've never tried one before. Do you know anyone who can help me out with that? And Ted came to me one day in my office and said, Kelly, what do you think about working with the Wharton County DA? And I went, home? What? Yeah, heck yeah, I'll help him. I grew up in Blessing, Texas, which is in Matagorda County. I think growing up in a small town is the most wonderful way to grow up. It makes you friendlier, it makes you more honest, it makes you more open. The county north of Matagorda County is Wharton County. I know Wharton County so well. I have cousins from all over the whole county. I can tell you the mascots of all the high schools because of all the football games we played with everybody there. I spent summers in Wharton County. It is like home. So I went down there to meet with Josh before I quit my job officially at the DA's office. And walking into that courthouse, you know, you have to remember that I'd spent my whole career in Houston at our courthouse. So I'm pretty sure they were all eyeballing me, wondering how I was going to be, because I would have been doing the same thing.
This is a woman who's tried 19 capital murder cases and gotten convictions in every one of them. So we hired Kelly as special prosecutor.
I came to work my first day and started reading the file. It was pretty easy to understand who Justin Hurst was. He grew up wanting to be a biologist because he loved nature and animals and the water and all that. And then the rest of his life story with Amanda and his son and his parents and everything about him. You couldn't find a more righteous victim in law enforcement than Justin Hurst. James Garrett Freeman, most people called him Garrett, grew up in Wharton County, born and raised, liked to hunt and fish. And I know lots of boys that go night hunting, and they have guns and they're drinking beer and things could go crazy. That's what I thought. He must have been really drunk, right? But Freeman wasn't. So that part never made any sense. James Garrett Freeman's family hired Stanley Schneider to represent him. I know him very well. At that point, tried 3 cases against him. He is a big city lawyer. He's also not even from Texas. I've seen him in the courtroom. I've seen how he talks to people. I've seen how he talks to jurors. There's no way Stanley's approach and personality is going to play in Wharton County. And in a capital murder like this case, you had the death penalty. Everybody knows what that means. But then the legislature enacted a new law, and you have, for the first time since 2005, life without parole. I think it's a very good thing that we now have this option, because every crime and every defendant and every victim is so different. In the beginning, Josh McCown, as the elected DA, with the family say-so, offered life without parole. Every time I've heard of a family that stands up and says, I don't need the ultimate punishment for my loved one, I can show a little mercy, that's a rare thing.
Normally it's a death penalty for killing a law enforcement person, but we did not want the law enforcement people that were involved to have to go through all the trial and relive that night over again.
Justin, breathe! Breathe, Justin! Breathe! Hey, Justin! Breathe!
But the defendant and his counsel refused it.
Then after I was officially on the case, all of a sudden, Stanley then wanted to revisit the offer of life without parole. And at that point, Josh called Justin's family back into his office with me to see what they thought about it at that point. I remember whenever I first got involved with the case, When I came to Wharton County and met Josh that first day and he told me about his relationship with all of y'all, I could tell already that that relationship was different than anything I'd ever seen before.
Just being small town and local, we all just knew each other. So when it happened, it didn't just happen to us. It happened to Becky, and it happened to Josh, and it happened to a lot of Wharton County.
Right. Well, they also all saw what you went through.
I do have to tell you, though, that when we sat in Josh's office and you were writing on a yellow notepad, do not ask me why I can remember that detail, but you were writing like crazy, asking me details about that night. And you sat there and I'm thinking, all I can think is this big time lawyer from Houston, I'm sure she's got her stuff together, but how is she going to be able to relate to us? And you sat over there and listened to me tell my story, and you were sobbing and just writing and sobbing. I was like, holy cow, she's got a tender spot.
Yeah.
And then when you told me you were from Blessing, Texas, I was just,
right then, yeah.
I was like, she's mine. This is my girl right here.
I remember the first time I met y'all to talk about, can we resolve the case without a trial? You remember that day?
Yeah.
And Josh, more than I've ever seen any prosecutor do, left a lot of, not the final decision, but a lot of it up to y'all.
Mm-hmm. I remember we decided, what our decision was, that we would give him the offer of life without parole.
And do you know why he didn't take it?
No.
Mm-mm. I think that his lawyer thought that he was going to beat the case because Josh didn't have death penalty experience. I think that was a very significant part of how that all played out.
I remember you saying, then we've only got one way to go.
When you choose to kill law enforcement, the people whose job it is to defend us and protect us, and you do that ultimate step, you have to be looking at the ultimate punishment. But there are people that disagree with that. The family felt like they had left life without parole as an option for plenty of time, and they didn't want to do that anymore, and they were ready to proceed with going through a trial and seeking the death penalty. I've been prepping for this case for about a month, and now it's finally time to pick the jury. Everybody in Wharton County expected Josh and me to get the death penalty. And the only thing we had to do wrong was pick one bad juror. It's got to be unanimous. And we have to try the case for guilt and punishment. So one of those jurors, this round or this round, that says, I just can't do it, we've lost. We started opening statements that first day. The courtroom was pretty packed. My goal was to tell a story about that whole night and how it all went down. And so we started with the way Freeman went out that night to go night hunting. Scott Blackburn tried to pull him over, and how it progressed, and to how he was able to load those weapons before he stopped. He knew when he got out of the car that he was going to start firing. And then the way he parked his car to try and take out not just Justin Hurst, but 6 other cops, and walk the jury through that so they would understand the calculated, premeditated massacre that Freeman tried to orchestrate that night.
I've never seen someone 5 foot tall fight like a bulldog like Kelly Siegler.
Stanley Schneider and Lee Cox give their opening statements where they lay out suicide by cop, which means that in that moment on that night, he wanted the cops to shoot him because in that moment he was depressed. That was going to be his defense.
There are people who attempt to draw out an officer and put them in a difficult situation where the officer believes they have to shoot. I think that could apply here, but one has to be able to try and establish that through past suicide attempts, through obvious depression.
If Stanley Schneider is successful in making the jury believe this all happened because of suicide by cop, Garrett Freeman could be found not guilty of capital murder, not guilty of murder, not guilty of anything.
In the process of going over the evidence and deciding what we're going to present, what we're not going to present, we as a team made the decision not to present the confession.
From what I understand, this is not your nature.
I don't know why the hell I did it.
My thinking was, along with Josh's, why would we use that? We'd rather have him take the stand if he wants to tell his story. Then he would have to undergo cross-examination and explain everything else. When you see the video of what happened, that's all you need. I wanted to make sure that everybody on the jury understood all the things that were going on strategically on the side of Freeman and the cops.
Freeman was crouched down below the line of the truck bed, shooting directly at Justin.
Justin was drawing Freeman's fire so the other officers could move out and they could then fire on Freeman. Had he not done that, the loss of life would have been tremendous because he was showing no mercy.
Justin, breathe! Breathe, Justin! Breathe! Hey, Justin! Breathe!
I truly believe I'm here because of him. I feel like he saved my life and the others.
Josh McCowan was the one who took me on the stand, and we went through the video, the way he positioned the truck. It's just what we teach our officers to survive. And as he was firing on the officers, he worked his way down and worked his way back to cab, which is his best cover, when he fired the last shot. That's someone who's counting. That's what we teach our police officers to do, to count your rounds, make sure that you don't run out of ammunition when you don't have cover. He's very experienced and very practiced. I found out when I interviewed him that he practiced almost every day with his weapons. And my theory is that he kind of fantasized about being in a situation like this. And why did he do it that night? Nobody knows. He did everything in his power to provide himself with the best angle, best cover. Nothing in his actions indicated in any way, shape, or form that he was trying to kill himself.
To me, it was important that every single officer involved in the chase that night and the shootout that night, for each of them, take the stand. And I wanted the jury to see that those men who testified in that trial, it changed their lives forever.
There are many lives that were affected by the actions of Freeman on that day. And every officer out there was traumatized by what happened that day.
People get this idea that cops are just want to get in shootouts and have all the glory, and that is far beyond the truth. I would not wish this on anybody, any officer, to have to even shoot somebody in their career, much less have their partner get killed.
Scott Blackburn is the person who is the beginning of this story. He's the other game warden who was best friends with Justin Hurst. Scott Blackburn was probably the most important fact witness. You want to make sure when you're laying out this whole crazy way it went down to the jury that they understand what all was going on in Scott Blackburn's mind as it started all the way until it ended. And you try your best to put into evidence all the little actions and steps that Freeman took.
I demonstrated how Freeman was using his guns. When he came out with the pistol, he took what we kind of call a military stance or a law enforcement stance, aiming at my vehicle and Sergeant Tierney's vehicle, and he was going back and forth, kind of a sweeping motion from vehicle to vehicle.
The tricky part with Scott was that he was so involved, invested, and traumatized, and it was just painful to watch him have to tell the story.
When I testify, I wear this called an end of watch bracelet. And so it has Justin's name on it and the day that he died. But when the defense cross-examined me, we watched the entire dash cam video together and critiqued every single thing I said.
I think the Scott Blackburn and all the other officers involved that night, that they all did a wonderful job, and there wasn't a person in the courtroom that doubted one word that they had to say. When Josh and I rested our case, we both thought that it was going very, very well.
Stanley had the Freeman family testify to the fact that Freeman had no violence in his background, and this was not him.
The world of people that knew Freeman was a really nice group of people. His parents were wonderful from everybody you talked to. We were dreading that because we knew they were going to be good witnesses, and they were. They tried their best to explain what happened that night, but I think the question that we all had, and maybe they had too, was, but why? Why? What was going on to make him do this? And I don't think any of them had that answer. Dr. Jerome Brown was called by the defense as an expert to try and establish even better this theory of suicide by cop.
The test that Dr. Brown administered to Mr. Freeman is essentially a risk assessment survey for characteristics that mental health professionals have identified as tending to elevate or decrease a risk. Personal responsibility, substance abuse, familiarity with firearms, all of those things are involved in those assessments.
I know Dr. Jerome Brown very well, and I've cross-examined him before. And Stanley should realize that if he's going to call a shrink to the stand, I'm going to read the paperwork. We got a chance to look at his records on James Garrett Freeman, which showed that he wasn't significantly depressed, which is huge if you're going to claim suicide by cop.
Kelly really crossed him hard. And when Dr. Brown was through, he was out the back door real quick. He didn't talk to anybody.
I'm pretty sure they were regretting putting him on the stand.
We were in there through the entire time.
It went on for
3 weeks.
3 weeks.
We watched the young man.
He showed no emotion.
There was no expression on the kid's face.
The trial was dreadful. Brought back all the pain all over again.
I remember telling the jury that he tried his hardest to massacre 7 cops. That would have been the worst law enforcement massacre in American history at that time. It's not real complicated, ladies and gentlemen. He didn't want to go to jail. And when you kill a cop after you tried to kill 6 other cops, if that's not capital murder, then what the hell is? The jury deliberated and came back with a verdict in about 4 hours. It matters where people are from. And these people in this jury, they're from Wharton County, Texas. And I thought I knew then how they were going to appreciate how this crime went down. And they weren't going to put up with it. And they didn't put up with it, and that's what their verdict was. He was found guilty.
It was a relief to hear the verdict. There was no joy on our part in hearing that.
Getting him found guilty of capital murder is what we were expected to do. The real challenge here was always, but does he deserve the death penalty? Once we start part 2 of the trial, we didn't have a lot of evidence. He didn't have prior crimes where we're going to bring in victims or cops. It was more about what is the defense going to do now, if anything, to make a jury think, I don't want to give him the death penalty for any reason at all. The defense brought in Dr. Deneen Milam, a different psychologist, to talk about her testing of Freeman and what she saw. And I remember reading her paperwork thinking, oh, I don't know that I would put her on in the punishment phase of the trial. Because on cross-examination, I was able to show the jury that buried in all of her paperwork was also the finding that when you test Freeman, he has impulse control issues, he has anger issues. That's the last thing you want to be able to introduce into evidence in a capital murder case when the issue before the jury is, are you going to be a future threat? Well, the most common future threats are the people that can't control their anger.
He's a continuing threat to society because no one who knew him his entire life could have predicted what he did that day. That means nobody could say with any certainty that he wouldn't do this again.
We waited overnight for a verdict for the death penalty. And that next day, the jury came back around right before lunchtime and gave him the death penalty.
It's bittersweet. You feel horrible for his family, for Freeman's family, because now they've lost a son. But yet you feel a sense of justice for the Hearst family, because this person who took their son away can't do that to anybody else.
Before I ever even came on board, Garrett Freeman was offered life without parole, and he didn't take it. And had he taken it, he would still be alive today. When I think about y'all's case and the trial, the thing that stands out to me is what happened after the death penalty verdict came down and the jury had left. Do y'all remember what happened?
I remember hugging his family.
His parents, James Garrett Freeman's parents, they had nothing to do with what their son did that night, and they paid the price for that. What they went through too is really, really sad.
To bury their child, and especially after making such a poor decision, you know?
No.
God, no mom should ever have to go through that. You know, our community loved on us and held us at high esteem at all times, and I can't imagine being on the other side of that. She wasn't on trial.
I know.
She didn't make the mistake.
No.
They were just normal people like us, you know? After Justin's death, of course, you know, you go through a roller coaster, and I was livid how anybody could just take such a sweet soul and gun him down like that. And then it took a while for me to realize that it was never anything personal, because the guy didn't know Justin. And had he known Justin, there's no way he could have done that, because Justin was just a good person. He was a good, wholesome person.
My God, what a wonderful man. There was nothing bad about Justin.
There's not a day go by that you don't think of Justin. That's the way it will always be.
To have that actual father figure take you hunting and fishing, teach you how to tie ropes and fishing line, it's not there for me. But she's been here my whole life, helping me through all of it. She does her hardest.
Yep, we've done good, haven't we?
In 1994, I took on one of the newest, biggest cold cases that I ever handled in my career. And at that time, I was a pretty new chief of one of the district courts in Harris County. The sudden deaths of John and Ruth High happened 6 years earlier in 1987. The Highs were a really nice elderly couple, but there were a lot of dark twists and turns trying to figure out what happened with this case. What the investigators uncovered was a person so twisted and diabolical that he even started to believe his own lies, and that's what made him even harder to catch.
Even if, for instance, there was something that I had done and I confessed to it, y'all dragged right down with me.
He's evil to the core.
It took a cleverly devised phone call ruse to try and get enough evidence on the killer, but would that be enough? I had to go to trial basically relying on the testimony of one pretty unsympathetic witness. How are y'all?
Good, how are you?
Oh my God, so good to see you.
Good to see you too.
It's been too long, you know it?
Too long.
Too much. How are you? How are you? Give me a hug. I remember this case because it was one of my first introductions to the best guys at HPD Homicide, because it was my first cold case and because the victims were so sweet and innocent. What were the family dynamics back then?
Everything was normal. Well, I
felt.
recently graduated college and recently got married. So.
And I was in college at the time.
When it happened.
Mm-hmm.
So talk about that day when you first hear that something horrible's happened.
I was with my dad at one of the facilities we operate, and we were there working together, and my mother called him and said that nobody's heard from my grandparents.
And he went over there to check on it.
Mm-hmm.
On October 8th, 1987, 5 p.m. in the afternoon, the Houston Police Department receives a phone call from a gentleman named Ken High. He was concerned about his parents. They had not been able to reach him by telephone, and so Ken High had gone around the house, peeking in the windows, and he noticed his mother was laying on the bed, and he was concerned that she may have passed away. And he wanted an officer to come there to perform a welfare check. The officer arrives, he meets Pat and Ken High. The officer notices newspapers on the front of the porch. The door was locked. And so the officer makes the decision that he's going to kick the door in. The officer immediately detects the strong odor of gas. And he observes an elderly male on the floor. Face down, there's a pool of blood around his head. There's an outdoor gas cooker hooked to the dryer gas jet just inside the kitchen. You would not want to use that type of cooker inside the house. The officer immediately turns the gas jet off, and the gas starts dissipating in the residence. And he looks at the body. To him, it's obvious that this person had been dead for several hours. Since it's the High's residence and it's an elderly male on the floor, the initial assumption is that it would be John High. Next, the officer proceeds to the master bedroom. He finds who he believes is Ruth High. There was a book beside her, and one of the pages was folded over as if she fell asleep while reading her book.
My partner and I are sent to the scene. I did the inside work, trying to determine if there's anything indicating foul play. We had to wait on the medical examiner because we're not really allowed to touch the body for further wounds. My partner, who was doing the witness portion, he informed Ken and his wife that his parents were deceased, possibly of gas inhalation.
My dad and my grandparents were very close. He was devastated.
I just couldn't believe that both my grandparents were gone at the exact same time. That just doesn't happen to many people.
So what you have at the scene is the smell of gas. You see a gas cooker hooked up in the kitchen. You see an elderly man, John High, lying on the kitchen floor. You see Ruth lying what appears to be peacefully asleep in her bed. No forced entry and nothing stolen from the house.
It was the officer's belief that John had fallen while messing with the gas cooker, struck his head, knocked himself unconscious, and either died from that wound or gas asphyxiation. And that Ruth High had fallen asleep and that she was overcome by the gas fumes as they moved through the house. It's an accidental death. They wrap it up, and that was it.
This is Grandma and Grandpa on their 50th wedding anniversary.
Oh, wow. They got dressed up a lot.
They got dressed up a lot.
No kidding, look at that.
My grandmother was a native Houstonian. She was a homemaker.
She loved bridge. She loved her friends, loved to get dressed up for different events.
My grandfather worked for a Gulf Oil Corporation for 49 years. He was a geologist. He enjoyed being outdoors, golfing, fishing.
Oh, how cute. This
With both of us.
That's y'all?
That's both of us, yes.
And Susie, the dog. We had Christmas Eve with our grandparents every year, and now we continue that as well. And that's what keeps them alive for us.
On the 9th of October, I was instructed to travel to the medical examiner's office and meet with Dr. Perungal, who had performed the autopsies. The medical examiner immediately informed us that John died from 6 blunt trauma blows to his head. That created 6 lacerations, 2 to 3 inches in length. This is not a natural or an accidental death. John High had been murdered. After it was determined that John was murdered, we need further investigation because there was no forced entry into the house and there was nothing to indicate that Ruth was murdered. There was a possibility that Ruth High had killed her husband. It could have been a murder-suicide and that she died because the gas building up in the house. We need to return to the scene to see if we can find any information, any evidence that would be helpful.
I think the key to investigating any murder-suicide is to be methodical, thorough, and make sure you don't overlook any single detail. Finding any forensic evidence becomes top priority.
After the medical examiner's report, going back to a scene, we noticed some things. When someone is struck in the head, you have cast-off blood, and some of that was detected on some spots of the wall. And we found an axe handle behind a curtain in Ruth's bedroom. We think there's a possibility it might be the murder weapon, but we're not sure, so we collected as evidence.
There's a gas jet cooker on the floor. The gas cooker is designed to cook crawdads or shrimp. I went to the refrigerator and checking in the freezer, and I did not find any shrimp. There was a candle that had been lit, but it was out. If it was designed to set the gas off, somebody didn't know that. Natural gas doesn't behave that way. It tends to rise, so a candle would not have affected it.
This makes us think that somebody has planned this. Someone left the gas on in hopes that the house would blow up. And in the process of blowing up, and destroy any evidence on the body, and then it's going to burn any other evidence up inside the house.
Murder-suicide was just unbelievable. My grandparents had a wonderful relationship.
Seeing them at their 50th wedding anniversary, knowing them from my childhood, that just was not possible. They loved each other way too much for anything like that to happen.
We suspected double homicide or a capital murder. It was something that we'd have to look into. Something that was unusual was John and Ruth's will were lying on the table in the living room.
John and Ruth High made the beneficiaries of their estate Ken High and his brother Gary High. Their estate was around $300,000 to $500,000. So everybody in the family needs to be questioned. You just can't arrest somebody. We need something.
It was a cold case.
The male, who refuses to identify himself, begins talking about a double murder that happened in '87.
One day has passed since the deaths of Ruth and John High. The murder investigation that started out as an accident and then turned into a murder-suicide based on what they saw and thought happened. The investigators realized how important it was for them to interview Ruth and John's sons, but the medical examiner called first.
Dr. Perungal called the homicide office. When he looked closer at Ruth, he noticed she had bruising on the inside of her lower lip, consistent with her lower teeth. Then he sees petechiae, small blood vessels that break when you're suffocated or strangled. She was probably smothered with a pillow or some sort of object forcefully against her face, causing the lips to be bruised by the teeth. Ruth High was murdered just like her husband.
With that knowledge, then the investigators needed to go back to the scene because there is no forced entry and the doors are locked and nothing appears to be stolen, and consider the idea that this is going to be somebody committing this murder who's in the world of John and Ruth High. Usually when you're talking about a murder, it's going to come down to one of three different main motives. It's going to be either greed or jealousy or revenge. But it sure feels like money is going to be the main factor here because they're worth some money. The number one priority would be to start talking to family members and very close friends about all the dynamics going on with that family.
Ken High is very successful. He's married, has 2 kids. He's close to his mother and father, but doesn't get to see them real often. He explains that he's not very close with his brother, Gary High. He blames that on their age difference. Ken is 8 years older than Gary.
Uncle Gary, my dad's brother, is the type of person that did not talk much, very reserved, very quiet, not very emotional. You just couldn't break that shell to get to know him.
We learned from Ken High about a guy named Duncan, Chuck Duncan. Chuck was the last person to speak to John and Ruth High. Chuck Duncan is business partner of Gary High, but he's also a lover to Gary.
Chuck was over at my grandparents' house all the time, doing stuff for them, helping them go to the doctors and things like that. He was always be invited to family events. He was pretty much included with anything that Gary would have been invited to.
As the investigation proceeds, we learn that Gary High is in a business called High Tech with 2 other people, Chuck and Robbie Duncan.
Ken felt that the company was not doing real well. They were having financial problems.
Ken opens up and he thinks Gary has been asking his dad for money. We need more information.
On October 9th, Gary, Chuck, and Robbie come into the homicide office and are interviewed.
The 3 men had a very unusual relationship. They were business partners, they were roommates, they were friends, and they were lovers.
We learned Robbie actually has changed his name from his birth name to match the name of Chuck Duncan. The 3 individuals function as a family unit, all live together, with Chuck being the head of the family. It's obvious during the interviews that he has firm control over Robbie and Gary High. Chuck wanted to lead the conversations. Like if you said, what did you do yesterday? And if they go to answer, he said, oh, remember you went to... It's like it's a little bit of a cult leader. You know, he's got such control over them. Chuck explains that he sees John and Ruth High often. He ran errands for them, even took John High to the doctor. The subject of the cooker comes up, and Chuck says that John High wanted to fry some shrimp. So Chuck went out and purchased a cooker and delivered it to the Highs. At the scene, we noticed some wills laying out in the open on a table inside the residence. Chuck alleges that John High and Ruth High wished to change their will and leave their inheritance to Gary. When the subject came up, Gary was surprised. You could tell by the expression on his face that he had never heard that before. I think in Chuck's mind, if he could have John and Ruth change their will, cut their oldest son out, then he would control whatever their inheritance was worth, $500,000.
We started questioning Gary, Chuck, and Robbie about their business to see whether they were having financial problems.
They said the company was doing well. So when we asked them how much money was in the bank, they guessed about $40,000. Bank records indicate something else. It was less than $10,000.
So then we tried to determine where they were, when the murders happened, Gary and Robbie were in Seattle, Washington, where they were trying to set up a new business. Chuck was in Houston. He adamantly denied that he had anything to do with a double homicide, and even suggested that a gardener or a yard worker or something like that may be responsible for this.
Chuck Duncan is very smart and manipulative and controlling, and he's quick on his feet to come up with explanations and answers to convince HPD of what happened.
As investigators, Chuck raises the flag for us for a couple of reasons. One, he's the last person that saw John and Ruth High. Two, he is in dire straits financially. But you got to have evidence. You just can't arrest somebody.
When I first went to Special Crimes and they started to bring me all their cold cases, there were a couple that came through where I would read them and I would know who did it, but I didn't think there was enough to charge it. So I would keep the file and I put them in this drawer in my office, and I named the drawer my Waiting on God drawer. Those were the cases where I thought one day something's going to come along from God, from heaven, to make this case get solved. For example, a divorce, somebody getting out of prison, somebody all of a sudden coming forward with new information after so many years can make the case change. You're waiting on God to make it happen. 6 years after the murder of Ruth and John High, the Waiting on God drawer came into play, and God finally made something happen.
In August of 1993, night shift officer working in the desk in the homicide office receives a phone call from a male who refuses to identify himself and begins talking about having knowledge about a double murder that happened in '87. He even names John and Ruth High. He talks about his knowledge of it. Wants to know what kind of trouble he could be in. The officer, he tape records it. When I'm listening to the tape recording, I recognize his voice. It's Robbie.
Robbie Duncan was the third member of the triangle relationship between him and Chuck and Gary. At some point after the investigation kind of quieted down, Robbie Duncan left the relationship. He talked a lot about how much control Chuck Duncan had over both him and Gary, and how good it felt to get out of that controlling relationship.
After Robbie called the night shift desk, Johnny Moore came to me. He had this cold case that was 6 years old, the murder of John and Ruth High. So myself and Johnny Moore drove out to Kingwood, where Robbie was living. He greeted us, invited us in, was very cordial, and almost like a weight was off of his shoulders because he was cooperating with law enforcement and doing the right thing.
He's willing to talk, but he has concerns. He wanted immunity. And we decided to offer him limited immunity. If he didn't commit the murder, he would not be prosecuted.
Robbie was granted limited immunity, meaning that anything he would testify to under oath couldn't be used against him. It made him feel safer, which helped further the prosecution of the case.
He said during their life together, Chuck would bring up the subject of if the Highs would just die.
According to Robbie, Chuck believed that the Highs were millionaires. So if Gary came into the inheritance from his parents, Chuck would definitely benefit through his relationship with Gary. Robbie admits that Chuck was talking about committing the murders to benefit them financially, but he claims he didn't know when it was going to happen.
One day, on October of 1987, Robbie and Gary decide to go to Seattle to see if it was good to move their company there. Chuck Duncan calls up to Seattle. Chuck tells Robbie, I did it. I did it. It's over. John fought like hell. And Ruth went peacefully.
Then Robbie said, talk to Gary, handed the phone to Gary. Gary has a blank, sharp stare, not speaking much. There wasn't a sense of excitement that they're finally dead or that there was trepidation that they were going to get caught. It was more of a realization that the murders had been carried out.
During my 16 years in homicide, I've come across a lot of killers. Chuck Duncan is evil to the core. You know, they were friends with him. He doted over them, but he doted over them with a sick purpose to worm his way into their money. I mean, he had to plan this. This is his cold-blooded murder.
Knowing about a crime after it's been committed, knowing who did it and knowing what happened, but yet not reporting it to the police does not make Robbie guilty of a crime in Texas. And so choosing not to come forward to tell on Chuck doesn't make them guilty of anything. Makes a jury not like them, doesn't make them guilty.
There was no physical evidence, no fingerprints or video recordings or anything of the crime. And so we formulated a plan on how to get incriminating information and build a stronger case against Chuck.
Let's see if we can get Robbie to make a phone call to Gary High and Chuck Duncan, and hopefully get Chuck Duncan to make some sort of admission.
If you have someone, a civilian like Robbie, acting on behalf of the police, that might not be allowed if you're calling somebody who's locked up in prison behind bars. You got to remember, Duncan is in the free world. The same rules don't apply. That's why this is not entrapment.
There's always a danger to tipping off the suspect in the case when you have someone who is not an actor play this role. Chuck answered the phone. They started talking, and I'm standing there writing notes to Robbie on what to say.
Is Gary still living with you?
He had a lot of trouble after the situation. Gary went into a deep, deep tailspin.
And then Robbie said, there's a private investigator who's looking into this matter. He's going to ask questions. What should I say?
I don't know if he's going to ask, you know.
Don't. You don't have to answer anything.
Robbie's trying to be really good about how he handles him. But when he says, I wished you wouldn't have done that, Chuck says, I didn't do nothing. I'm not guilty of anything. But somewhere a long ways down in there, he indicates that he did it for the family unit.
We've gone through it. It's over with. It's behind us. And even if, for instance, there was something that I had done and I confessed to it, do you think you and Gary wouldn't be unscathed by it? I mean, y'all be dragged right down with me.
The most incriminating thing that Chuck said was, law enforcement has no evidence. Just stick with the story. You got to be strong, because if I go down and confess, then everybody goes down.
Well, yeah, you know, that's why.
I won't allow that to happen. I won't.
He was threatening that they could all be implicated. And that was essentially making a tacit admission that he was involved in the murder of John and Ruth High.
I remember listening to those tapes, listening for that juicy slip-up that Chuck Duncan made. There's not one. There's more little subtle innuendos, things that you wouldn't say if you were completely innocent. But the context of these tape-recorded conversations, along with the financial incentive with Ruth and John's inheritance, the fact that the company was really crumbling and not doing financially well at all, you have your motive. The fact that Chuck Duncan was the last person to see them alive, and that along with all the other circumstances about how the house was left that day, that's enough to move the case forward.
We then secured an arrest warrant for Chuck Duncan for capital murder.
After getting our recordings of the telephone conversations between Chuck, Gary, and Robbie. We obtained an arrest warrant for Chuck Duncan. Sergeant Belk and I flew to Seattle, where Gary and Chuck are now living.
We met with a fugitive task force. I approached the front door with a couple of police officers, and they banged on the door. There was a long delay. They kept banging on the door, and then eventually looked up on the second floor, and a white male looked out the blinds at us.
Eventually, Chuck came to the door, and he was told he was under arrest for murder.
There was not much reaction from Chuck Duncan when we took him into custody.
Gary Hise and Chuck Duncan. Our information was that they were living together, so it was not a surprise that he was there.
My goal was to try and talk to Gary while the tension was high and see if I could get him to cooperate. Gary asked, "Am I under arrest?" And I said, "No, you're not under arrest." He said, "Well, if I'm not under arrest and you don't have a search warrant, then y'all need to leave the townhome." I mean, Gary's parents were murdered, and he refused to cooperate, refused to talk to us, ordered us out of the house.
We have nothing whatsoever to indicate that he helped plan it. And we know he didn't participate in it. So, he gets to walk.
When your dad realized that his own brother could be involved, can you talk about how that affected your dad?
Never have seen him so sad in all my life.
Yeah.
Wow.
And I think he just felt so deceived. And so, how could this happen?
I think I'd be mad too, mad and sad, and just want to scream at your brother.
It was more about Chuck.
Really?
Yeah.
Really? What do you think he ended up thinking about it?
Chuck just had control over Gary.
Even before all this, you could tell?
Oh, absolutely.
Really?
Chuck was taken to a local law enforcement agency and read him his legal warnings. He acknowledged that he understood the warnings and waived them and was willing to talk, which was no surprise because he was a talker. And he thought he could talk his way out of everything.
He thinks he's smarter than you are. So he's trying to figure out what I might have or might not have on him. And so he's really curious.
I told him that Robbie fully cooperated with us and also told him about the phone calls were recorded.
You can see his wheels are turning. Now he's trying to think through the conversation.
Setting up this recorded conversation with Chuck Duncan is kind of like what we do on Cold Justice every case we work. You try to get them to give you a statement, a version of what happened, and then they're locked into it because they've said it. Then if they change that version, that can be pretty damning.
He knew he was in a lot of trouble. And so, in typical fashion, Chuck concocted another story.
I didn't do it, but I helped do it. Ruth told me she wanted a mercy killing. She wanted somebody to kill her and her husband because they were old, getting frail, and she didn't want to suffer.
And Ruth was paranoid about that. She says, "I need to be able to rely on you, Chuck." She says, I would do anything in the world for you and Gary and Robbie, but I got to have peace of mind, and if I can find a solution. She says, "I don't want to wait until I'm in a wheelchair being given tranquilizers at a nursing home." She says, "I can't face that." And she said, "I would rather pick and choose the time of my death." And that's exactly what she said.
According to Chuck, Ruth asked him to find someone to kill her and she would pay for it, kind of like an assisted suicide or whatever. He called it a mercy killing. He says, "I wasn't there, so I really don't know what happened. I hired 2 yard guys to go do it. And one guy's name was Oscar, and then he mowed the facility where their business was."
I told the boys, not Rob and Gary, but these Hispanics, that they were old and they wanted to go out peacefully. And this is a sum of money, and the money would be there waiting in the house, and for them to pick it up. And that was how the arrangement was.
We had no other choice but to pursue names of all the yard men. We interviewed them, and We knew it was a bogus story, but you still had to close that door.
In his mind, the fact that he presents it as a mercy killing, he would only do a little bit of time in the prison if he was found guilty.
Chuck is putting himself directly responsible for the deaths of John and Ruth High, but not admitting that he physically killed them. It didn't matter to us. We didn't need the truth. We just needed an admission, and he made an admission.
Chuck Duncan is charged with capital murder in the deaths of John and Ruth High.
This case was actually filed 2 different ways. One is it's a double murder, 2 people were killed, and also it's a murder for remuneration. When a murder is committed over money because of money, you can also file capital murder charges that way. I think that when you listen to every line of every word that came out of Chuck Duncan's mouth, Chuck Duncan did not help himself by talking that day to Billy Bell.
Billy, Sergeant Bell, he's a very good interrogator, very good interviewer. He's a hostage negotiator. Since I had dealt with Duncan before, I thought Billy would be a good fit.
And it worked.
And it worked.
As we get ready to go to trial, I remember, because I looked at the date, I was 5 months pregnant then.
You were?
With my daughter, who just became a prosecutor a month ago. Isn't that funny? It's been a lifetime, Johnny.
Yes, it has.
But this was my first cold case where it had this twist to it. And I think the big thing for me was how much the whole case came down to Robbie. I knew that I had to figure out a way to let Robbie get up on the stand and testify against Chuck Duncan. But the main challenge of trying this case with Robbie is that I didn't know what a jury was going to think about him. I didn't know what a jury of 12 people would think about a grown man being involved in this odd relationship and knowing full well that 2 wonderful people have been murdered and never telling anybody in law enforcement the whole truth for 6 years. How are we going to make sure that the jury understands he's credible? Because if a jury hated him, we were going to lose. One thing I had to deal with the case once y'all passed it on to the DA's office, from the very beginning I was always very stressed about Robbie. When he came forward, thank God he did, but it took 6 years. Was the jury going to hate him? You know, getting the jury ready to understand where he was coming from, and he did the right thing. Even if you think you would have handled it differently, let's see if he's credible.
Right.
He was the foundation and crux of the whole case.
Sure.
I was taught a long time ago as a baby prosecutor, every case has a theme. You take the weakness of your case and you make it your theme. So in this case, the issue with the case was, what are we going to do about Robbie? You have to take that and make it your theme and deal with it head on. He comes kind of tainted. He comes kind of muddy because of the way he came around to finally telling what he knows. One opening statement, I brought up that Chuck Duncan committed the murder, but in August of 1993, Robbie could no longer live with what he knew, and he called and came forward. And maybe he took too long to get here, and maybe he didn't do it like you, but we are only in this courtroom because that man came forward. And the bottom line here was to make the jury believe him, even if they still didn't like him. My plan was to have Robbie testify last, so that by the time he hit the witness stand, HPD, the investigators, would have already explained the rest of the physical evidence and all the other incriminating factors against Chuck Duncan. On the off chance that maybe a couple of jurors might not like Robbie, they still understood the lay of the land and his part to play in all of this.
Kelly Siegler is a rock star. She was excellent in the courtroom before a jury. Very persuasive, methodical in building her case. But the biggest impact that my testimony had was Kelly Siegler playing the confession I had with Chuck Duncan, and in his own words, him explaining that he's ultimately responsible for the deaths because he did a mercy killing.
I told the jury, if this was really a mercy killing, why would you need to hit John High 6 times in the head? So the whole story was just stupid in the first place, and it even ended up being kind of laughable. Like, if the jury's going to buy that, come on, no one's going to believe this story, just to show yet again what a manipulative liar he is. He was too big for his own britches, as my mother used to say. So as much as I could present evidence-wise, It was time to call Robbie Duncan to the stand. Before the trial, he came down to my office and we sat there for hours going over the questions for direct. We practiced it. He knew what he needed to do and say. I tried to play defense lawyer and throw cross-examination questions at him and things that I thought that Connie Williams would pick on him about. Connie Williams was Richard Charles Duncan's lead defense lawyer. He was very well respected. He was very well known, and Duncan was very lucky to get him to be his lawyer. That was the single longest written out prep for a witness of any case I ever had, because usually you have, like 10 civilian witnesses with a little piece.
Right.
But Robbie was the motive. Without Robbie's information, though, think about it, getting the jury ready to understand that Chuck killed the Highs for their money would be pretty much impossible. Robbie was the relationship and dynamic. Robbie's the one that shed light on Chuck's control over them even after confessing to the murder. He was the last witness. He was almost a whole day. He told the truth, told it like it was, and then Connie Williams cross-examined him. And I remember thinking, past the witness, okay, here we go. How's this going to go? And Connie started cross-examining Robbie, thinking as he went on, he's doing okay. You just have to sit there, right? Being cool. He's doing okay. And I thought, ooh, he did all right.
He always came across like he was telling me the truth.
Yeah. Some of it was my prep, but Robbie was pretty good. Every kind of way they could insult him, Connie did a good job of trying to do. Why did it take you this long? Isn't it true that you're mad at them and you're paying them back? Isn't it true you helped? Isn't it true you're involved? He might have gotten a little defensive, but even when he got defensive, his answers made sense. He owned that he should have come clean sooner. He owned that he should have been less of a mouse around Chuck Duncan, that he should have been more of a man and done the right thing. He owned all that. You just have to hope that at the end of the day, that came across as credible to the jury. On May the 25th, 1995, after 6 days in trial, I rested my case against Chuck Duncan. The evidence was mostly circumstantial, but it was a strong case. Now, I remember telling the jury in final argument, you know now what kind of a man he is. And so you go back there and you ask yourself, is this man who sits before you today guilty of capital murder? Because if you don't believe he is, are you going to let him go home with you?
I don't remember Chuck looking very concerned. I think he thought, I'm going to keep getting away with things. It was very hard to see him there, knowing that he was the one that took my grandparents' life.
The jury went out. I think it only took them about 20 minutes, and they came back with a guilty verdict, guilty of capital murder.
After that, Chuck was sentenced to death.
After all this time, John and Ruth got justice.
When the jury came back with the death penalty, I felt happy. I felt vindicated. I was glad for my dad, and I was thinking that my grandparents were in heaven shouting hallelujah.
Whatever you think of him, if it weren't for Robbie, Charles Duncan wouldn't have been executed. Because of him.
Right.
Because of him.
The whole case.
The whole case.
Right.
And that's not an easy thing to have to let your whole case rest on one person.
It's not.
But that's what happened.
Charles Duncan was executed by lethal injection in 2003.
Chuck's last words was, I'm innocent.
Wow. You think at the last minute, the defendant, the killer, will say they're sorry and admit it, and they never do. I've asked a lot of families after they go through an execution. The first time he got scheduled, I was supposed to come with y'all, and it got reset, because they always do. And then it finally happened in 2003, 8 years later.
There's no comparison of what happened to Chuck and what happened to my grandparents.
Right.
Even though there's not full closure, it is closing a chapter and feeling like there's been justice that's been done, for sure.
I still run into way too many families that never get justice. Mm-hmm. They're still waiting to get justice. So what would you tell somebody?
Don't give up. Have hope. and be there for each other so that you can get through it.
After the trial, Ken High never tried to fight Gary High in court over the will, over the estate. They let him have his share, but they never spoke again. And when he passed away, they didn't go to his funeral. My very first cold case that was a death penalty case was far from easy. This case revolved around the issue of having a not sympathetic witness. And so addressing that head on were the keys to the prosecution of this case. Not what a lot of people think are the problems with a death penalty case, especially today in the age of DNA and forensic evidence, but it boiled down to something that simple. Justice for the High family did not come quickly. It took a lot of years. The waiting on God drawer came into play, and they finally did get justice.